Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to Lunch and Learn with the Clinic. We're really thrilled that you can be here today. My name is Sarah Brandt, and I will be presenting today. I wanted to give you a little bit of background about the clinic and about our Lunch and Learn series. At the clinic, we seek to advance outcomes for deaf and hearing children who have developmental and communication challenges. This may come in the form of direct services for individuals, including therapies or assessments, as well as support services like consultation and training, like we're doing today. Please do reach out if you feel that we may be of service to your family, your team, or your child. We are eager to support and partner with you. Our Lunch and Learn series is a monthly series, topic-based, that is led by our clinician team. This is the second of our series. It will always run on the second Wednesday of each month at 12 o'clock Eastern Time. It will always be recorded. It will always have ASL English interpreting. And so we're going to ask you to spread the word within your personal and your professional networks so we can get the word out there about this series to reach more folks, because we are eager to partner with you. My colleague Adrienne is on the webinar today, and she's monitoring our chat and Q&A. So please feel free to use those features to ask questions, interact with other participants. We will save as many questions as possible till the end to see if they are addressed in the presentation. We aim to keep these short and sweet, half an hour, just kind of whet your appetite for some of these big thinking ideas. And then we leave time at the end for questions. But please do use the chat if you are having any issues with accessibility. All right, so let's get started with today's topic, which is we don't have time. Reframing and supporting foundational needs. As I said, my name is Sarah Brandt, and I am with the clinic providing educational services. I have a background as a teacher of the deaf, a classroom teacher of the deaf, and curriculum coordinator and support specialist. I have this picture here from a well-known children's book because I often feel that I wear many, many hats, which I think is something very common to teachers and professionals and caregivers of children with complex needs. We wear lots of different hats at lots of different times. So I felt like that kind of represents how I feel sometimes. You'll see through the presentation that a lot of the photos and the analogies that I'm using are sort of mountains and nature and outside and hiking, sort of something I love to do. And I think that theme actually kind of supports some of the topics that we're talking about today. So that's where that comes from. So we're going to cover three things in a short amount of time today. The first is understanding foundational needs. What are they and why are they important for our complex learners? Then we're going to talk about some strategies to reframe our approach, how we think about these needs and how we address them. And third, we will talk about integrating these foundational needs into learning goals within the IEP or IFSP, depending on the age of your child or students. All right, so first we're going to talk about foundational needs. What does that even mean? What are we talking about here? So here we go, another mountain analogy. I love this stuff. So when we think about the IEP, which is the legal document that outlines the services and supports that our student needs, it's really divided into two areas. The first is called academic achievement. And these are the way things are kind of defined legally in these documents. That is classroom-based areas such as reading, math, science, social studies, and history. And within the IEP, we define the strengths that a student might have and the needs that a student might have. And sort of on the other side of that valley, we have what's called functional performance. That's the way it's defined in the IEP. Those are defined as skills or activities that are not considered academic, including activities involved in everyday living. And similarly, there are strengths and there are needs that are identified for a student in the IEP. I find it interesting and frustrating that functional performance is defined as being not the other thing. To me, that tells me what it's not, but it doesn't really tell me what it is. And I think that we do a disservice to our students with complex needs by fully separating these two things. I want to acknowledge that functional performance being included on the IEP wasn't always the case, and that it's really critical that it is now something that has to be considered for these students because it's really, really important. So it does certainly belong on the IEP, but I think that putting things into the academic bucket or the functional foundational bucket and not thinking about how those connect does a disservice to our students. So when we think about that word functional, what does that even mean? What does it mean for something to be functional? They talked about things being activities of everyday living. I would be remiss to not have a presentation without a few memes. So a few of my favorites. I want you to know I'm not here to tell you I hate math or that you shouldn't teach math, but these all happen to do with math instruction. There's a picture saying my math teacher 20 years ago, you won't always have your calculator with you. And me now with laughing, holding the phone. Many of us carry a smartphone that has a calculator in our pockets all the time. The other meme saying, I'm glad I learned about parallelograms instead of how to do my taxes. It's really come in handy this parallelogram season. And finally, wow, another day as an adult without using the Pythagorean theorem. I'm not here I like math. I'm not here to tell you not to teach math. These are just examples of things that maybe some of us have laughed at or experienced as adults, thinking about the things that we learned as students, and did they prepare us for the things that we need to do in our adult lives? And I want to apply that same thinking to our students. By doing that, what I intend is that we really want to bridge this gap between academic and functional performance, find the connection between the two. And we're going to do that by reframing how we think about these needs and integrating functional or foundational and academic learning into the learning goals that we write for students on their IEP. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about foundational needs, what they actually are. What are the kinds of things that fall into this bucket? I like to think of them as all the things that your brain and your body need to do in order to be ready to learn. And it can be lots and lots of different things depending on a student's needs. Things like regulating your sensory system, having opportunities for movement breaks, access to vocabulary if you use an AAC system, ensuring that your body has been cleaned and freshened and your hygiene taken care of, ensuring that your medical needs are taken care of if you have discomfort due to something like a G-tube or needing a position change, students who might rely on a visual schedule to predict their schedule, ensuring that's ready to go. If we have educators in attendance today, these are probably very, very familiar for things that you feel like maybe are constantly on your list of things you need to be doing, addressing these foundational needs. These are often viewed as the things that happen before you teach, or the things that happen before you instruct, before you provide a therapeutic service, before you have a meaningful activity with your family. They seem to be kind of clumped in that. These are the things that happen before you get to the good stuff. And what I want to do today is to give you the grace to let these be the good stuff, that reframe these and present them in a way that it doesn't need to be not academic to cover all of these things. You can integrate them with those other learning areas to make them more meaningful to the student. I want to acknowledge that supporting these needs is really, really hard. It's really hard, especially if you have multiple students in your class who need these needs met in a variety of different ways, at a variety of different times, throughout the day, throughout the week. It is hard for sure. Why is that? One reason is time. As an example, something like a position change. If your student is a wheelchair user and needs to have their position changed throughout the day to keep them comfortable and healthy, that takes a long time, and you can't rush those things. It's time consuming to address those needs. Some folks report that they don't feel they have enough resources to really address these needs effectively. Maybe it's something like modifying or adapting materials for a visual need. As a teacher, to come in the morning before your lesson and realize, oh, I forgot to print those symbols in the right font size or the right background color. It can be overwhelming if you feel that you don't have the resources or the support and help to have those things ready for students. And it also is hard because teachers and providers have so many demands, that there's such a large load of things that they feel, I have so much I have to teach. I have so much I have to get through. How on earth can I do that and address all of these needs in the, the before things? It can be really, really hard for educators. And I also would propose that supporting these needs is critical. Sure, it's really hard, but it's also really, really important. And why is that? The same three reasons, one of them being time. If you are constantly adapting the same materials over and over again, and your teacher in the room next door is doing the same thing, and maybe you don't realize that you're both kind of reinventing the wheel, no one really has time to, quote unquote, spin their wheels. It's important that you work together to address those foundational needs so that students have access to the things that they need. Another reason that supporting these needs is critical is that it doesn't need to be big monumental changes. They can be small things, and they can be incremental things that can make a big impact on a student. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in our next section. And finally, the demands. When you think of that curriculum frameworks or all these state standards or all this, curricular units that you have to get through, I think it's okay. And I want to give you permission to give yourself the grace to step back and say, well, what is the success for this student? And we'll go more into this, but if I get through this curriculum on all this stuff I have to cover about ancient Greece, and I get through the end of that curriculum, but then there have been some of these foundational things that are sort of not happening for this student, have we really addressed their needs, and have we really set them up for their success? Maybe not. So, Little Mountain, more on that later. We're going to be getting into that throughout the rest of this presentation. All right, so part two, we're going to talk about some strategies to reframe the approach. So how do we support the foundational needs of complex learners? What can we do? I have two sets of strategies that I'm going to share with you, and I do have a handout that will be included in the post Zoom email that goes out to you that you can feel free to use and share with your networks. Okay, so the first four, I'm going to do them in a set of four and then another set of four. It's not because one is more important than the other. It's just because I think that the second four are kind of a lot harder. So let's start with the first four here. The first is that addressing these foundational needs is non-negotiable. They always have the highest priority. If you have to miss a beautifully designed lesson because something else comes up to address a need that a student has with their brain or their body, that's fine. Shift the lesson if you need to. If those foundational needs aren't covered, your beautiful lesson probably isn't going to be effective anyway. So make sure that you non-negotiably schedule addressing those foundational needs so that then your beautiful lesson can be implemented more effectively. Next is that it's respectful. Be sure to prioritize dignity and privacy and involvement for students. Some of these things can be really complex and very personal, and particularly as students grow older and into their teenage years, they're challenging for some students. So always communicate what you're doing and why you're doing it, and acknowledge fears and protests. Sometimes some of the addressing foundational needs is unpleasant for students. It's not preferred, and acknowledging that maybe they don't want to be in the stander, acknowledging that you hear them, you see them, and explaining this is why we're doing this because of the medical, whatever it might be. But always acknowledge that those things are being communicated to you by the student. It doesn't mean that you don't do those things always because the student doesn't want you to, but you work together to make sure they understand why. Next is that it's reciprocal. As much as possible, make sure the child is as active as they can be in addressing their foundational needs. So if there is flexibility in when and how these needs are met, maybe there are certain, maybe at least once in the morning, they need to be using the stander. Maybe the child can choose, do you want to do this during math or do you want to do this during art, whatever it might be. Give them as many options as you can to make them an active participant in addressing these needs. If the child relies on a visual schedule to help them progress through their daily routine, maybe they can be a part of physically making that schedule, printing the icons if they use icons, laminating them, cutting them out, putting it together in a way that's effective for them. If the child can be a participant in that, help them engage in that to give them some ownership over how these needs are met. And finally, it's scheduled. That means it's regular and it's expected. If you know that going through a child's hygiene routine takes 45 minutes and every single time you miss math, then just schedule it and don't always miss math, push math. Let this block have the time that it deserves in order to be met. That's okay. And also utilize your teaching assistants or your support staff if you have them. If there are certain sorts of preparatory materials, if materials always need to be in a certain font or a certain color or whatever it might be to support the students, make sure that the staff has the training they need to sort of take that burden off of you as the teacher to have that ready for the student. Okay, our second set of 4, which I don't think is less important, but I do think can be a little bit more challenging to address these needs. Our first is that it is strategic. So don't be afraid to be creative and, think outside the box a little bit. So if, for example, I have an example in the text here, if you know that a student is going to be going on a trip, maybe not so likely at this point in time, if you know that the student's going to be traveling or going to the dentist or whatever it might be, set up role plays, practice routines, practice vocabulary to help them engage in those activities that are foundational to maintaining the health of their brains and their bodies. Make it part of what you do in the classroom. It's integrated, so multitask. This depends on the need of the student, of course, like everything, but it certainly is possible to, quote unquote, kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So maybe you have to travel to the nurse's office multiple times a day and you count by 5s while you're walking to the nurse, or you have a particular game that if the student needs to be on a mat table and needs to be on their side, maybe you have a certain visual or a book or something that's accessible to the student during that time, so that while you're addressing the foundational needs, you can also be doing something else at the same time. Addressing these needs can be collaborative. Reach out to your teams, your therapist teams, BCBAs, nursing teams, reading teams, whatever support staff you have in your setting. Utilize those folks to help determine how it can best be met. We often have great ideas come from our therapy teams, our physical therapists. Oh, let's try seating them in this particular way during this lesson and see if it helps them stay engaged, and often it does. Utilize your networks. It can be very, very helpful in making some of these things be a little bit smoother. And don't forget that a key member of the team is the student themselves. Engage with them and amplify their voice and make sure that their voice is included as you think about how you address these needs. This last one is probably the hardest. It's consistent. To the best of your ability, apply these strategies all the time. I understand that that's a bit of a pipe dream, that we all are working and functioning and living in homes and classrooms and settings that are in the real world. And sometimes things have to get juggled and shifted, and it's not say not always, or maybe not ever, as smooth as you might envision. But to the best of your ability, to the best of your ability, if there's a behavior plan, follow it all the time. If the student has an AAC device, use it all the time. Always set yourself up with the highest expectations that these needs always are prioritized for the students. I'm going to skip ahead here and talk about our part 3, integrating these foundational needs in your learning goals. So a key part of this is thinking about how you select and write IEP objectives or goals for your students. Sometimes you might be thinking sort of close up. It's like the picture of the leaf in the lower left, the close-up view. It's the short-term goals. It's what you might want the student to achieve in the next quarter, or by the end of the school year, or within the IEP period, versus sort of the long-term goal, the vision for the students, sort of this panoramic view of these beautiful mountains. What do you want the student to accomplish in 3 years, 5 years, in 10 years? What's the long-term vision for post-graduation, post-transition? It's important to keep both of these in mind as you're thinking about setting goals and incorporating foundational needs. So a few examples here. I'm curious, and feel free to use the chat, if these goals look like the kind of IEP goals that you might have written or seen before. Telling time to the quarter hour on an analog clock, appropriately interacting with others in the community, identifying main ideas from a text, those sorts of things. Are those the type of IEP goals that you potentially have seen in your setting or with your students? I'll give us a moment here to see if anyone has anything to share. I am able to see the chat, seeing all the time. All of these look familiar. These are not bad goals. These are good goals, but we have to contextualize them a little bit. So now put those goals aside for a minute and think about a long-term vision. Might this be an appropriate long-term vision for a student with complex needs? Paid part-time employment at a local restaurant or retail store. If you work with students in transition, does this sound like the kind of vision that might be developed for a student with complex needs? Very frequent vision for transition age students. Yep. Don't forget, even if you're a preschool or early intervention teacher or elementary teacher, those students become transition students. So it's never too early to be thinking about building out a vision. Now, if we think of these things together, if we are setting a vision of employment locally at a restaurant or store, do these 3 goals still help us get to that vision? Maybe, maybe not. Telling the time on an analog clock might be appropriate. There might be other strategies we could put in place for a student. Appropriately interacting with others while in the community. Yeah, that's going to be really important. Absolutely. Identifying main idea and details from a text may be less important in this setting. It doesn't mean that any of these three things are not important to the student, but when we have a long-term vision, it helps us select shorter goals that help us get to that vision. And additionally, it helps us think about, I mean, I have had the experience of seeing the same particular goals over and over and over again that a student is struggling to achieve, or perhaps we're not providing instruction in the right way to help that student achieve that objective. And we just keep repeating it on IEPs again and again. That's an area where you have to say, wait a minute, this might not be working for this student. So when you're setting goals, I have 4 recommendations. Make them functional, realistic, current, and independent. I have a few examples here. So we have a student here with a picture of brushing their teeth and a student doing math. I really think I should have selected better examples because you're going to think I'm anti-math, which I'm certainly not. This is to argue that if we provide so much academic content to students and they master that content and they can name the life cycle of the frog and list the characteristics of ancient Greek civilizations, but they can't brush their teeth, they can't engage safely with others in the community, these kinds of things, I would argue that we have done that student a disservice. So think about, it doesn't mean you don't do math, but it means that you certainly prioritize those skills that are going to help the student be independent in the community, whatever the vision is for them. Be current. So this is kind of where this whole thing started for our setting, this coin ID and money ID. So many students, year after year after year, were focusing on coin ID and identifying nickels and pennies and then putting them together and how much is the amount. But at some point you have to stop and say, how many of us even carry around cash? Is that a useful thing for people this day and age? Is there a better way to teach students to be independent with money to the best of their ability? There's lots and lots of ways to learn about money. There's apps and there's payment through smartwatches and the tap thing. There's so many ways. Maybe coin ID isn't it anymore. Maybe there's better ways to let students be more independent with money. And lastly, focus on independence. So here's an example. We have the grilled cheese and we have the bowl of cereal. If you have a student who works really, really hard and learns the different pieces of equipment and the different ingredients they need to make a grilled cheese, and with some hand over hand help, they can slice the cheese and cut the bread, but then you really have to provide a lot of safety supervision as it's cooked on the stove. Have we really given that student a skill that they can independently use in their future? Versus if we teach the student to independently prepare themselves a bowl of cereal that they can then enjoy on their own, I would argue that that is a more functional and independent skill for that student. So think about setting goals that are things that the student can do as independently as possible. Addressing these foundational needs doesn't mean that you don't also get to do cool, fun academic stuff. It just means that they can be overlaid together in effective ways, and it can be done in a group. So here's an example of a group of students who are visiting a local greenhouse and they are learning about the life cycle of the plants. It can be really engaging and exciting and fun, and students like the plants, and it's great. They're learning academic content that may be relevant to them. But they are also doing lots of other things at the same time. I'm not going to read all of these examples, but some of them, for example, are a student who is participating in his healthcare and hygiene routine while he's in the community versus using his familiar routine done at school or at home. We have a student who is maintaining appropriate physical and verbal behavior through the duration of the community outing. Another student who's working on combining symbols on the AAC system while in the community to make a comment or generate a request. So these aren't things that are specific to going to a greenhouse or being learning about plants, but they're foundational needs that are addressed in a way that's overlapped. It's that bridge that we had between in the valley with the academic and the functional performance. It's that bridge right in the middle, meeting both of those needs. So when we think about integrating these needs into learning goals, a few recommendations are to make sure you're considering the short-term and the long-term vision. One alone is not enough. Now, I recognize that for those of you who work in early education, thinking, I'm going to set a long-term vision for a 5-year-old. Of course, you're not necessarily going to set a employment or a living for, but it doesn't mean you don't think about it. That student is going, they're 5, they're going to be 10, they're going to be 14 and hitting transition. And if you haven't thought about it at all, I think that you'll feel unprepared. So always think about what comes next for students. Develop goals that are functional, realistic, current, and independent. Sometimes these students are using technology that's beyond what I use for myself, and that's great. And bridge that divide that we had between academic and functional or foundational performance. Integrate foundational goals and academic activities to the best of your ability. So that was a really, really fast 30 minutes. So today we talked about 3 kinds of things. What are foundational needs? Why are they important? What do they look like? And why are they hard? We talked about strategies to reframe our approach. That was the 4 strategies. And then the second 4 strategies to reframe how we think about foundational needs and how we approach them in our practice. And then how we integrate those foundational needs into learning goals. I think the next step for many educators is to sort of take another step back and think a little bit more globally. If you are planning a curriculum unit, how can you address needs throughout that unit in a way that kind of hits students who might have a variety of needs? So if you're developing a unit on the winter holidays, what are the kinds of foundational needs that you might be able to hit through that time? And how can you integrate those with the academic content that you might be learning about the holidays? So I want to thank you for your time and your attention and your dedication to these students with complex needs. On this slide, there are a number of ways to connect with us. So we have our email and my work email, our website. You can reach out to us on Facebook. We're really looking to connect with you. So please do know that these will be available to you in the follow-up email. But I want to stop my screen share here and open the floor to questions if we've had any that have come in through the chat, or feel free to pose them now. And I'd love to hear from you and learn more about your experiences with supporting the foundational needs of students in your settings. I can share a few examples from our practice that I think have been really effective for integrating the needs, both with the foundational and the academic, as well as our therapists coming in to support as well. A number of years ago, following the wildfires in Australia, one of our transition classrooms was looking to get involved. How do we support? How do we help? And so the teacher and the occupational therapist collaboratively came up with an idea to make and sell bracelets as a fundraiser and then send the money to Australia. So the students in their classroom learned about geography of Australia, some history, animals, etc. And then they used this little device that has a crank on it. I think it's like I forget the name of the actual brand, but it's a weaving machine that you crank this way and it like weaves the bracelet. You can select the colors, you can select like the design of what the weave looks like. So some students were able to physically crank the weaving machine to create the bracelets. And our occupational therapist came in and made that weaving machine switch accessible. So it was actually a switch accessible blender that then sat on the weaving machine. And as the blender spun, when the student pressed the switch, either with their hand or their leg or their head, whatever was appropriate for them, it would spin the blender, which would then spin the weaving machine and make the bracelet. So the student was creating the bracelet themselves. Then they had to do a lot of other activities like estimating how much materials they would need, how much it was going to cost. They had to travel to the local art store to buy the materials they needed. Then for staff that purchased them, they delivered them in the school. This became a multi-month project that addressed a lot of foundational needs for students in a way that was really engaging, really fun, and then empowering, because at the end they had, I don't know how much money they raised. It was multiple hundreds, or I don't know if it was $1,000 that they were able to then donate to people who had been impacted by those wildfires in Australia. It was a great project that was done collaboratively.
We do have a question in the chat, Sarah. Someone's asking, what recommendations do you have for teachers who have students who are at very different levels, all in the same classroom? How can they adapt their lessons to include everyone, especially when some of the academic content might not be as meaningful for some students?
Great question. So I think that when you think about content being meaningful, to me, sometimes content is just the vehicle to get to whatever it is that you're trying to teach. So if it's the planets, you're teaching about the planets. And for some students, learning about the planets, that's the goal. We want them to learn about the planets and know the planets and whatever they're going to do with the planets. For another student, using the exciting and cool content of the planets to give them an opportunity to maintain visual attention to the materials for 10 seconds, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever is appropriate for that student, that's the goal for them. So you may have a student who is, writing a 5-paragraph essay about the planets, and another student who is engaging with materials for, maybe it's tracking visually or touching materials related to the planets. It's not so much about the planets for that student. The planets are cool. The student might really like it. So in that way, it is meaningful for them because it gives them an avenue to get excited about their learning. But that foundational need behind it might look like you're just teaching about the planets, but that's not the goal for that student. The goal is really the tracking or the engagement or whatever it might be for that student. So think of, it can be one lesson, but it can hit different things for different students.
I love that. That's so creative. That's really helpful. And another question here is if you can give some examples of how this can support generalization of skills.
I think that's so important because how often we teach things and then, maybe parents don't see it at home, or parents see it and we don't see it at school. And if we only are able to perform in one setting, it doesn't really help bring that skill forward in a functional way for the students. So I think this was something that we noted during the challenging time of remote learning, that students had the opportunity to practice skills in their home settings, and parents had the opportunity to see teachers the way they teach or the way a therapist would provide therapy, but in the home setting. And when you try to put aside the challenges of time and schedule and parents' workloads and those kinds of things, which were monumentally challenging, the opportunity for parents to potentially be involved in seeing, oh, that's how you teach it, and the therapist say, well, this is why I'm doing it this way, I think was a really beneficial thing for parents. So I think that helping families understand why you're doing what you're doing is a really helpful way to support generalization. And I think that it's sort of a simple answer that students won't generalize if they don't have the opportunity to. So just go into the community as much as you possibly can. It's slightly more accessible now than it was in the most recent months, potentially for some students. So just practice the strategies in as many different places as you possibly can. I think that's a somewhat simple answer, but give students the opportunity to practice that generalization. And it doesn't have to be expensive field trips. It can be, visits to local stores or settings that don't necessarily cost money to enter. I know vehicles and gas and those kinds of things cost to be in the community, but you don't have to think of it as going to a museum or a big full day out of the classroom. It can be, we're going to the supermarket, or we're going wherever it might be for a short amount of time on a regular continued basis to really practice those skills out in the community. If you go to the supermarket regularly, That's great. Maybe go to different supermarkets. Don't always go to the one right down the street. Go to the, the Costco and the smaller, local store, whatever it might be, the mini mart, so that, if you're teaching a student to make a selection and use their smartwatch to make a purchase, and they always do it at the same Stop and Shop up the street, that's great. Now they can do it at Stop and Shop. Let's also make sure we go other places that they can practice that skill as well.
That's great. I love that. That's really helpful. I love earlier in your presentation too, you kind of hammered home that point. You said that these foundational skills can be the good stuff. So I think that's such a good example of it. It doesn't have to be a flashy field trip. It can be a trip to the grocery store.
Yeah. Sometimes those are the most successful outings that we can have. I think my big takeaway is give yourself the grace to let these be the big things. That if you can find a way to integrate these into your day and it goes relatively smoothly, that's great. You've had a good day. Are there other questions or comments that would like to come through? More than welcome. We will be, this recording will be shared with you through your email for you or any colleagues who registered, so it will be accessible. We are working to post these on our website, but it's just taking a little time for our web team to get everything set. So that will be coming. So all of our lunch and learns will be always free and accessible after the fact, but we are looking to get that set up very shortly. I think we had something come through on the Q&A.
Looks like there's one new question here. Yeah, on the Q&A, someone has asked, do you have any examples of how YouTube or music may be regulatory for a foundational need?
Absolutely. I think that music or YouTube can be really useful. Sorry, I just need to move my window here. I think that in our setting, it's really common to see students who need a position change and maybe are using a mat table to then be provided with an iPad to then listen to music or watch YouTube. And if they need that for a regulation strategy, and that's recommended maybe by the student's occupational therapist, then that's great. But always keep in mind, maybe we explore, if music is the student's thing, can we get music about educational things, or can we find ways to, let's listen to this new artist and I don't know, could collaborate with your music teacher. Maybe they're learning about music from another culture or another country. Maybe you can use that during their time that the student is using music to regulate. So there are always little ways to layer on sort of layers of integration with other things that are happening in their day. But I think that the occupational therapists may be a great resource to learn more about how music can be part of that. Certainly in early education, I mean, music is so critical in, we sing our routines, clean up, everybody. A lot of us know those little tunes that we use, and students can use them to help regulate and get through their day. So if that is a strategy that students really respond to, absolutely. I think that could be considered a foundational need. And if you attended our last Lunch and Learn about Gestalt learning, I think you might find that using music or phrases is also a key component for many complex learners in their language development. So look back at our last Lunch and Learn and see how we can kind of connect these two as well. Our next Lunch and Learn will be January 12th. Of course, that's a Wednesday at noon. It will be focused on providing language opportunity, increasing communication opportunities at home. So we hope that you will join us on that opportunity. We will be emailing information about that probably right after the holidays, when people have maybe had a chance to disconnect and then reconnect. So we appreciate you taking the time today to join us, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.